Today, what we're going to talk about is Guardium data protection and how you can use it to protect your critical data within your environment. And I want to frame the challenges first off before we get started. We'll only have a couple of slides and then we'll jump into a demo. But the thing that we are seeing most of our customers have to deal with is the explosive growth of data across multiple platforms. So from the traditional databases and unstructured data on file systems, we're seeing growth at a good clip there. And of course, with all the movement to cloud, there's pretty significant growth. But also analytics and platforms like big data are driving quite a bit of growth. And it's really twofold because it's not just volume of data that's growing, it's the data's moving. It's getting spread out and going to different places. So we definitely have something to contend with there. The other thing is, of course, threats aren't going away. We're continuing to face breaches, and the cost per record varies widely from one industry to another. But within financial services, which you are in, we see one of the highest costs per record at $221 per record. So with say 50,000 records, we're up to a $10 million loss potentially. So that is leading us to the discussion of risk, really. And if we look at risk as a calculation or the product of what you have to lose times the likelihood that you lose it, we can kind of get to a number that we can use to help us guide decisions on where to put our effort and our money. If we continue on the path of that calculation, our likelihood of loss based on a Ponemon Institute is 20% of organizations globally will experience a material breach within the next 2 years. So we can use that as our likelihood at 27%. 27% times 10 million, well, we're talking about some big numbers, $2 to $3 million potential loss. So this really, it emphasizes the need to understand where and what our critical data is. So not only that, but who's accessing it and who has access, and how vulnerable that data is to potential loss. Of course, anything we can do to harden the environment will lower the risk. So with that, I'm going to jump to our demo environment here. Start out with a quick conversation about discovery and classification. So discovery in this first step is going out and looking for databases on your network. So it's basically doing a network port scan, looking for anything that looks like a database and then telling you about it. Once you establish connectivity to that database by providing credentials, now we can go start looking at the data within it to do classification. So that's where we're going to spend our next section here, is on understanding classification. So we can do that with the use of a dashboard. Pull up this dashboard. And briefly, the process of classification is going to take a database that you've identified, and it's going to search through the tables and columns, and then take samples of data from that database to understand and look for patterns that look like data that we're interested in. In this case, this dashboard is centering on personally identifiable information. So it's going to look for patterns of things that look like names, addresses, date of birth, etc. So very quickly we can see from this dashboard view that we've got this large number here, 129 data elements that are not protected in a policy. So the policies are what Guardium uses to monitor activity. And when it sees database activity, it'll apply the policy looking for specific things. And one of those things will be, does this data sit in a group that represents something sensitive? For example, personal PII. So in this case, we have 129 data elements that are not protected currently. So that's a concern that we want to address. We can also see pretty easily that we've got MySQL containing quite a bit of personal information. DB2 and Oracle also have some. You can see a distribution of those databases. And let's pull up one of these and blow it up. We have across the board the data elements that we're seeing in our databases, and then by database type. We can blow that up and take a look at what we're looking at, really. So our classification policies have gone out and looked for data that looks like addresses, like city, county, dates. Large number found within dates, but of course, within any database, you're going to have a lot of dates. So whether it's a date of birth or not will depend on other things like the names of the columns, and we'll do our best to identify, but you might see some higher rate of false positives there. But basically, this is the type of information we're finding within this MySQL database. So all visible at a glance. Classification is something that you want to perform. It's not just a one-time thing. You want to do it on a regular basis. So on a regular basis, you'll be wanting to run the classification, then have somebody review that. So this chart is just showing us that we have a couple of users that have been sent review requests for a classification result set, and their job is to go look at the alerts. Look at the notifications on their to-do list, identify the report for classification, and then sign off on that. The audit process will keep track, so you can go back and see that, yes, we identified this data, so-and-so reviewed it, signed it off, and now we have a record of that. So the next thing I'd like to go talk about is vulnerability assessment. So this is really about hardening and reducing our risk by making our systems less vulnerable. So again, we're going to leverage a dashboard that'll give us a quick view of where we stand. And vulnerability assessment is a process where we connect to a database and then examine things like patch levels and other configuration items which might indicate risk. And we perform tests against those databases. So a vulnerability assessment scan is the unit of measure here. And what we're seeing in our first chart is that we have no failed vulnerability scans. Great, well, that's what it should be. We're also seeing that we have failed tests performed within those scans against different database types, and that we are seeing, DB2 and Oracle have lots of failed requests, MySQL not as many. We can have charts that will show us a little more detail based on the severity. So here, if we compare DB2 and MySQL, we see that DB2 has quite a bit more critical severity failed tests than MySQL. However, whether or not this is significant is really based on the context. So number one, what data is contained with it? Well, we know what data is in that DB2 database based on our classification process, but also the context of how is this database being used? Is it tied to an application that is an internal facing IT help desk? Well, then there's probably not a lot of risk because this is internal to your network. While if this MySQL database is connected to an internet-facing application used by your customers, well, that certainly would have higher significance. So this may be where we want to spend our effort and time. Another thing that's interesting here is just look at failed tests individually. And in this case, this first item in the table, we have a failed test on a DB2 database where it's telling us that we have a patch that needs to be updated. So currently at DB2 10.5, fixpack 6, and we should get it up to fixpack 10. Considered critical, and this was determined through our Guardium development team, and this is a Guardium test that's performed. This external reference is interesting because when the development team goes about developing these tests for vulnerability assessments, they're looking at classifying them by a number of different ways. One is just things that they come up with. In that case, you're going to see Guardium with a test ID. But we also look at tests and tie them back to CVEs, which is very useful. We also tie them back to implementation guides like CISA-STIGs or CIS implementation guides, and then tell you specifically what part of those guides this test is failing. Okay. So once you have these recommendations and you followed through on them and hardened your systems, the risk should potentially be lower. Now let's jump over to monitoring. So monitoring activity within your environment can can be done with policies. And well, I mean, if you really wanted to, you could probably do it by just staring at, database logs all day. But it's kind of hard to do that. It's hard to come up with significant threats or risks that you're seeing because there is so much volume of data. So the what you're looking at here is the active threat analytics dashboard that's going to help you make sense of the activity that we're seeing. So what you'll have is a couple of charts. The first one being kind of over time, what kind of activity are we seeing? Activities will be coming from a couple of different sources. One are going to be the policies that you define within Guardium. So this is stuff you told Guardium to look for, right? The activities like failed logins within a certain time period, or privileged users accessing sensitive data. So these are driven by policies. The other category of things we're going to see are outliers. Outliers come from our outlier detector, something you can enable within Guardium. It's going to observe database activity over a period of time, a couple of weeks initially, to set a baseline. New activity after that baseline has been set will be analyzed with a machine-based learning algorithm that's going to search for patterns in the data and try to classify them in terms of anomalies. So the types of anomalies that we can identify are things like account takeover or cross-site scripting, OS command injection, or SQL injection. So we've taken a large amount of data and analyzed it and boiled it down to a particular case. So what we're seeing in the table below here is individual cases where we believe that there's something that needs to be investigated. So for example, our first command injection here, it's a high severity. We've got 5 different attempts at a communication, possibly using a ping, that indicate there could be a command injection going on. If we want to investigate that more fully, or let's say we just immediately say, no, that's a false positive, this is not important, we can close the case and get rid of it. But in this case, we want to dig a little further. And since this one has a user tied to it, I'm going to look at the user's behavioral analytics. And I can observe that this user has multiple cases associated with it. So certainly things that look risky, things that are looking like cross-site scripting and SQL injection, OS command injection. I can look a little bit deeper and check the user's risk profile. Here we have a fairly high risk profile, and we can see that this user has risk factors that include violations primarily. We have other categories of risk factors as well. But if we needed to go and investigate more deeply, we can see what these individual violations were. So we can start looking at the investigation dashboard. So this is going to be a detailed look that allows us to drill down into any particular set of activity. In this case, this user's activity has been narrowed down against that one server. We can see that they've been hitting an Oracle database and a second database on the same IP address. We see some hours of operation that look a little bit on the high side, so they're doing some off-hour stuff. They're using admin tools to access the data and a variety of different SQL verbs, which don't on their own look too dangerous, mostly selects. But when we look at the table and specifically look at their violations, we can utilize the filters on the left-hand side here and narrow that look down and say, okay, well, we were looking at different threats, SQL injection, one of them. So here I'm narrowing this view down to just the SQL injection tautology violations, and I can see that they have been executing and what the SQL statements have been that they're operating on. So right off, this is starting to look like, yes, this is dangerous activity by a user. So now I need to do something about it. We'll close this out and go back to our case. And probably one of the first steps we want to do is, if we have ServiceNow and a ticketing system, we can connect to that ticketing system and push it out. ServiceNow is supported out of the box. So now this could be a ticket that's sent off to the security team for them to take action and talk to this user, figure out what it is that they're up to. Okay, so since we're on kind of the user track, another tool that we can help you understand uh, possibly dangerous activity or risky activity is Risk Spotter. So this is going to be another view of the data that's looking at it from a user perspective and identifying, set my dates properly, and identifying risky users that need investigation. So a couple of charts that just very at a glance will give you an idea of, okay, how many risky users do we have in these risk categories? So from lowest to highest, the darker the color, the more risky. Also, a risk over time, and what our risky users are looking like over time. The table at the bottom is sorted by riskiest at the top. So we're seeing a number of users in this list that exhibit some risky behavior. By hovering over the latest risk indicator dot on each user, we can start to get a picture. So we're looking at the top guy. This is our riskiest user so far. He has a rating of 7.15 on the latest run, and over the period of 3 days that I have specified here for this view, his highest was 7.5. So okay, so he's been fairly consistent in his behavior over time. And again, with just like we did with the user poly, we can click on any one of these to do individual investigation. But what I'll pose is the case where, let's say you have your manager come to you and say, hey, last night the red team did some penetration testing. I want to know what they got into. So now it's your job to come in and use Guardium to find out, well, okay, we don't know who the users were. We don't know anything really other than that there was some penetration testing. So let's go dig for that information and see if we can find it. For that, we can investigate risky users using the investigation dashboard like we did with before. And now we're looking at a broad set of activities. Now, what we want to try to do here is to narrow it down somehow logically. And we can start out by looking and saying, okay, well, we've got a lot of users that are doing stuff, right? And we see activity against multiple databases, but looks like this Oracle database has the most activity against it. Also, very spread out verbs that are being used in SQL statements. We can kind of just hover over these to get an idea, but wait a minute, that looks interesting. Looks like there's a lot of grants happening. So why don't we narrow this down by verb and say, you know, given, oh, wow, look at that, 14,000 grant statements issued. Definitely a place where we want to start looking, at least one of the places we could start looking. And that is, again, looking like this Oracle database is where we want to focus. So let's just narrow it down and start looking at just the activity around that Oracle database. Now our picture is starting to get a little bit clearer. That we have a subset of users that are involved in this activity. And let's start out with Bill. So if we look at Bill and then look at the individual activities that he's performed, and remember, we still have our grant as our filter, we see that Bill has been granting access to Don and Tom and Harry and folks that were in that previous list we just saw. Okay, so definitely something's up. If we check out violations, this is another area where we can see from our policies, both from the automatic ones I talked about through outlier detection, as well as our policies that we define within Guardium, we can look at the violation types and filter down on those and say, okay, well, all right, let's stick with grant commands for now. So here we can see that Bill has been granting access to sensitive information that's related to CCPA. Okay, yep, this is probably our guy, right? So we can change and look at what else he's been up to and look at, okay, risk indicative errors. So these are violations that we found that triggered error messages. And if we look at the SQL that's associated with these error messages, it looks like he's been hunting and pecking looking for credit card information, all right? So clearly an indication that this is a part of our group that was doing the pen testing last night. Now, since this is, since now, of course, we'd go off and we'd confirm, okay, is Bill one of the pen testers? Is he the user that was creating this activity? And if that's the case, we can say, hey, let's just drop that user into a trusted user group so that we won't bother with him in our risk analysis going forward. But if it was a real user, we have a couple of things we could do. We could create a ticket, again, pushing out to ServiceNow, telling the security team, look into this user. We could also add him to a watch list. Bill might be smart. He might say, okay, I'm going to do a little bit. It might get caught, but tomorrow and the next week, I'm just not going to do anything. We can add him to a watch list to make sure that we keep an eye on Bill and he stays in this list, even if his activity were to drop off. Another good thing to do would be add Bill to a suspicious user group. Now, if we add him to a suspicious user group, then we can use that in Guardium policies and then trigger things like if we're seeing activity against a sensitive object and the user is in the suspicious user group, then quarantine that connection and don't allow them to proceed. So we could actually block the activity if we needed to. Of course, we can create reports and share those. Probably one of the best ways to do this, because you do want to review risky user behavior on a regular basis, is again to use an audit process where these reports, you can set up an audit process and specify the report that you want to send out, send it to a specific set of people or roles, schedule it to run on a regular basis, and then those can be reviewed, and you can keep track of the fact that they've been reviewed. We take a look. We see here we have a run of this report for Risk Spotter. We can review the contents of that report and say, okay, here's our user with their violations and their risk scores. Once I reviewed it and I think, okay, no real risk, we're good, I could sign it off. Or I might say, hey, this really does warrant additional investigation. So let's escalate it, send it to somebody who will go and dig deeper. All right, so we covered classification, vulnerability assessments, we've done monitoring. So let's talk a little bit about compliance. So again, we're trying to make this as easy as possible for you to get started quickly. And in the case of compliance, we have smart assistants that'll let you hit the ground running, and they just kind of walk you through the process of setting up Guardium and getting started. So let's go. We have CCPA currently set up, but let's set up a new one. We'll set up a compliance monitoring for PCI. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we know what databases that we want to scan, and we'll have to have permissions to connect to those databases. Guardium gives you scripts that you can give to your DBAs for creation of the user accounts that'll connect and perform the tasks that we need to do for monitoring. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible there and getting started with the right credentials. We have a number of standards and regulations that we can help you monitor. For example, we'll be using PCI as our example, but we also can do HIPAA, PII, Basel II, GDPR, SOX, and so forth. So we'll go ahead and select our out of the box policy. Selecting. There we go. All right, and then we need to give it the scope of databases that we want. If we can pick from the database instances that have already been defined, or we can create new ones either by setting up credentials specifically to connect, or if you have them already set up in a CSV file, we could also import those credentials to save time. Databases can be grouped by application as well. So if you have a set of databases that you know are specifically associated with applications that are PCI that manage PCI data, then that would be an easy way to group them as well. Once you have your databases selected, we can move on to classification. So this is where we're going to tell it to scan through our databases and find data related to PCI. So we have a template for PCI classification. That's going to include things like looking for multiple types of credit cards like Amex and Visa and so forth. Those are driven by pattern matching, which will look at data samples and identify. We'll even run them through the Loon algorithm so we can validate that they are real credit card numbers. And then once we have positively identified PCI-related data, we can push that into groups of sensitive information for use in policies. So we'll select here to just scan for tables. We can also manually specify which tables we want within scope, but we'll just let it scan on its own. Now, for our purposes right now, I'm just going to skip this step and not kick that process off so I can continue. So at this point, we're almost ready. So we can see with the green checkbox the steps that have been set up and configured for us. One of the most important things, the policy that we're going to be using. So this is the Guardium policy. It's going to be monitoring activity on, and it's going to include things like failed login, log violations. It's going to be looking for DDL, DML. It's going to be looking for matches against anything that looks like a credit card. So this is in addition to the card holder objects. It's also going to look through the activity for things that look like credit card data. So that's our policy. We also see that we have a little caution sign next to populate groups. So this is also a step that we need a little bit of help on. We populate as much of this as we can. So, you know, we know what the DDL and DML commands are. Those are going to feed into our policies. But we don't know who your admin users are. So this little red dot is indicating here that we have to populate our admin users. That's done pretty easily by just adding members to the group. We can do that either manually, import it from a CSV file, or by performing queries against databases or directories. Okay, and once that's populated, at that point we can click on Run Setup, and it's going to execute the classification. It's going to push out the policies, and it'll be ready to go and start monitoring. We can see CCPA has already been configured this way, and the green checkboxes tell us that our setup is complete. We can view details and examine, okay, these are the rules within the policy that have been defined, the databases. So we're defining the scope of the compliance monitoring, the policies that are set, and a number of reports that we can just quickly jump into and take a look and see what activity looks like. So in addition to into this view where we're just kind of walking you through, we do have accelerators by regulation and standard. So these accelerators are here to help you quickly get started. For example, we have an overview of each regulation like CCPA. For those users that might not be familiar with it, they can just get a quick primer to understand what it is that we're dealing with. We also have a number of reports that are canned and ready out of the box for execution. Now, I like dashboards, so I'm going to show you the CCPA dashboard, and just to show that this data that's being collected and monitored on your CCPA in scope databases is visible in a very easy format that's tabular in form. So mostly we've been looking at charts, so this is tabular. We can see these at a glance, just high risk SQL errors. So there's quite a few of those, and that can lead to additional investigation using the tools that we've already discussed. So that is the end of the demonstration. So I'll open it up for questions.